Quest for Equality, The Failed Promise of BlackBrown Solidarity is the name of the book. University of Texas history professor Neil Foley is the author. Professor Foley, what was the good neighbor policy, and how does it fit into your book?
Well, that's a great question because in some ways it frames the entire book. Good neighbor policy is generally considered to be the work of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who in his inaugural address in 1933 said that the United States was going to become a good neighbor in this hemisphere. Now, he didn't spell out exactly what that meant, but certainly everybody in Latin America understood what that meant. That is to say, if you're going to be a good neighbor, does this mean that you are going to stop using dollar diplomacy and the big stick, that you're not going to be sending in the Marines every time something happens in Latin America that you don't approve of, and so forth and so on? And the Secretary of State under Roosevelt, Cordell Hull, reassured them, yes, that's exactly what we mean, that we want to be partners and friends and not be the Colossus of the North that basically treats Latin America as its backyard. So they were skeptical at first, but gradually they learned that Roosevelt meant what he said. And the test of that came in 1938 when the president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, nationalized the oil industry. And the British in the United States...
1938?
Yeah, 1938. What did I say?
No, you did.
Yeah, 1938, they nationalized the oil industry. Now, of course, the oil industry, the United States oil industry, Standard Oil of New Jersey, which later became Exxon and so forth, their solution was they can't do this. We need to show these Mexicans who's the boss around here. You know, sort of the old way that we did business with Latin America. And Roosevelt explained that they had every right to do that, that was part of what it meant to be a sovereign nation, that you could nationalize foreign investments, but that you had to compensate them for it, right? You couldn't just take and not give back. So the Mexican government came up with a formula for compensating the oil companies. And of course, the oil companies rejected the offer. It went to the Mexican Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said this is a fair offer. Franklin Delano Roosevelt said it was a fair offer. Just take it or leave it. They were upset because they expected Franklin Delano Roosevelt to say, oh, we are going to invade. We're going to send the Marines in to Veracruz the way they did in 1914 when they didn't like what was developing in Mexico. But times have changed and had changed. And FDR was not unmindful of what was going on in Europe at the time with the rise of the National Socialist Party, aka the Nazi Party, and the adventures of Japan while it was engaging in imperialistic wars in the Asian Pacific, having rattled its saber for a while there. The last thing he needed was to make Mexico potentially an enemy, angry at the United States. And so, but I don't believe that was his only reason for not shaking a big stick at Mexico. He believed that it was right and proper what the Mexican government was doing, right? So long as the Mexican government was responsibly compensating these oil companies. So what happens when Pearl Harbor happens, 1941, Mexico 6 months later declares war on the Axis powers after the Germans sank 2 of its ships off the Gulf of Mexico, and we became what historians call co-belligerents. We became allies in the war against the Axis powers. And so the United States, under the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, decided that it was high time to use this as an opportunity under the good neighbor policy to get all 19 American republics together to say we stand united to defend the hemisphere against Japanese, Italian, and German aggression. And I am arguing in this book and in a subsequent book that's coming out next year that this changed the course of U.S.-Mexico diplomatic relations from one of mutual suspicion and distrust to one of professional level communications from the foreign ministry in Mexico, the State Department of the United States, president to president, Many of you probably remember the sort of cozy relationship that George W. Bush and Vicente Fox had just before 9/11. And 9/11, of course, changed all that, not in the sense that U.S.-Mexico relations deteriorated, just that the United States had interests that took it away from Latin America and over to the Middle East and Iraq and so forth and so on.
So, but where does the failed promise of black-brown solidarity come into your story that you just told us?
Okay, fair enough. So I'm trying to give you the context for the United States' new relationship with Latin America. Okay, so let's go back into time and let's look at what the United States looked like and what it was doing, say in the 40s during World War II. Okay? This was a time when most people thought of race in the U.S. in terms of black people and white people, Negroes as they were called back then, and white folks. And not many people thought much about what we now call Asian Americans. We didn't use that expression back then. It's relatively new since the 1980s. We said Chinese, we said Filipino, we said Japanese, and a number of other epithets that sort of crept in along the way. And we didn't use the word Hispanic or Latino either. We said there are Cubans, and there are Puerto Ricans, and there are Mexican Americans. And in fact, in World War II, we didn't have a whole lot of Cubans living in Miami at the time. That came later, right? Basically after 1959. And even the Puerto Rican diaspora was a post-World War II event. Right? So Mexicans were pretty much confined to 4 border states, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, where their demographic center of gravity remains to this day. So most people didn't pay much attention to them. They were sort of in the shadows. Well, they come home from the war. African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and what had they just achieved? They had just defeated Hirohito and the Japanese forces. They had just defeated Hitler and Mussolini in a war that was to protect democracy not only abroad, but at home. They called it, the African Americans called it, a double V campaign, victory at home as well as abroad, meaning that if you're going to defeat Aryanism, the concept that there's a master race abroad, you can't come home and return to white supremacy. All right, so the context for World War II and the failed promise is you have these different ethnic groups. I chose to focus on African Americans and Mexican Americans coming home with the notion that we're not going to take it anymore. We didn't just go over there and risk our lives. And some of them, of course, didn't come home, and some came home wounded and were missing in action. They're not going to come back and just go quietly into the night, that is to say, into the back of the bus and back to segregated schools. And sorry, these jobs are not for you. We'll hire you as a janitor, but not, for anything that requires any skill. They said, no, we're not going to do that. So they came back, I would argue, more Americanized, even though they were Americans before they left, because the American ideal is equality under the Constitution. You don't say that the Constitution applies just to white folks and black folks who are American citizens through and through, and Mexican Americans like myself who are American citizens through and through by virtue of the 14th Amendment. I was born here, raised here. I would not feel very comfortable in a country that told me I didn't have certain rights that, say, you had, right? I would think that was un-American, right? And that's the way they were thinking. So the question I began this book with is, so if African Americans and Mexican Americans come back after the war saying, why do we have segregated schools? Why do Mexicans in Texas have to go to Mexican schools? And in California go to Mexican schools? And why do blacks all over the South have to go to segregated schools that are inferior? And everybody knew they were inferior. I mean, you could just take pictures of these schools and you could see that they were not the same kind of school. And I wondered why these two groups did not seem to want to work together to achieve similar goals. What were the issues that tended to divide them? So that was the original question I had. And one of the things you learn when you think about coalitions of groups coming together, it's one thing to have a common agenda. But it's quite another thing to have some kind of mutual understanding and trust between you. I mean, this is the basis of any kind of solidarity, right, is the ability to step out of your shoes and to put yourself in someone else's position and say, even though this isn't exactly my agenda, I support you, right? This is why so many say heterosexuals, support rights for gays and lesbians, right? Because even though they're not affected by the Marriage Act, they believe that no American citizen should have their rights curtailed because of race, nationality, creed, or sexual orientation, right? So a similar kind of thing I had hoped would have happened back in the 40s and 50s.
Was there an attempt by Mexican Americans, African Americans to work together on discrimination issues?
Absolutely. And what you find is that at the grassroots level, back then, I would argue all the way up to the present moment, African Americans and Latinos work together in unions. They work for better wages, better working conditions, because it's in the best interest of everybody, right? That's what they want. They're all employees of a particular company, okay? But what happens if you want a job, okay, and in the defense industries in World War II, and they're not hiring African Americans or Mexican Americans, right? So that puts them in a position of competition. Okay, so when you hear, for example, today, fast forward 60 years later, and you hear, they take our jobs, okay? Well, I don't think immigrants are taking the jobs of a lot of people in the United States today, African Americans, Asian Americans, and so forth. But that's open to debate. If you go back into time, you will see that if you look at African American history, they've always viewed, not always, but often viewed immigrants as their main competitors, right? Not white people, obviously, but immigrants, because when the immigrants come over, whether they were Irish at first, who were looked down upon as an inferior kind of European, Irish were not hired back in the 19th century, the potato famine, all the way up through the early 20th century, really. We all know about the problem that Italians had sort of fitting into white culture. Everybody thought of them as criminals and mafia and, some kind of inferior European from the southern part of Europe, sort of the Mediterranean rim, Sicily, not the sort of the Nordic Europeans, right? The northern, the Norwegians and the Swedish and the British and the Germans and so forth. The southern and the eastern Europeans were not as desirable as potential American citizens and as immigrants. Okay, so African Americans have lived through a successive wave of immigrants coming over here who have a really rough time of it at first, but then their children are U.S. born, and they shed some of the cultural appurtenances of the home country. Oftentimes they've never even been to Italy, right, or to Poland, right? And by the third generation, sociologists tell us,